Hello and welcome to this lecture that is part of the Premier Skills Institute series on getting ready for the breeding season. This lecture is on resumption of ovarian cyclicity in postpartum beef and dairy cows. My name is Marijke Beltman and I'm based in University College Dublin. I cannot give a lecture on postpartum resumption of cyclicity without walking through hormonal events that happen around parturition. So at around parturition, we get a decrease in circulating estradiol concentrations, and this is followed by an FSH surge, which occurs within 10 days postpartum. FSH leads to the growth or the emergence of a cohort of follicles, of which one gets selected to become the dominant one, and the others will undergo atresia. During the early postpartum in beef and dairy cows, there are LH pulses, but the LH pulses are not very frequent, and this prevents the development of selected follicles to preovulatory size or preovulatory estrogen production. That means that you have follicular wave turnover that can continue for quite a long period of time. After the initial FSH surge, you'll get a second FSH surge, and in this scenario, there is also an increased LH pulse frequency, which is enough for the LH surge and ovulation to take place. The LH surge on its own initiates final maturation of the oocyte and therefore makes it ready for ovulation. All these events are influenced by other events that happen around parturition. So in the dairy cow, negative allergy balance affects this whole process negatively and will affect LH pulse frequency. In the beef cow, it's maternal offspring bonding and nutrition. The increase of LH pulse frequency, as you see here, happens when the negative energy balance goes to a positive energy balance, or when there is weaning or improved nutrition in beef cows. So what happens to these follicular waves? In general, they last about 7 to 10 days. And when they start, it's an increase in FSH, so you have these estrogen active follicles. Then the next phase is the selection phase, where you have a decrease in FSH and the selection of a dominant follicle. And the dominant follicle, the dominance, will prevent emergence of a new wave. That dominance is then LH dependent. There's atresia of the dominant follicle if the LH pulse is every 3 to 4 hours, and the ovulation if there is 1 pulse per hour. During the cycle, the LH pulse frequency is limited by progesterone. Postpartum, it's limited, as I said, by suckling, energy balance, and body condition. So during late pregnancy and parturition, that period, initially to mid-pregnancy, follicular waves continue, which is why we sometimes see cows that are pregnant in heat. And in late pregnancy, what happens is that you have high estrogen and high progesterone, and follicular growth and FSH are being suppressed. After calving, you have a change, low progesterone and low estradiol. That leads to a resumption of recurrent FSH, usually within a week. And then the first follicular wave gets you your first dominant follicle, but this one may or may not ovulate. And that has to do with then the estradiol produced by this follicle and the concentrations of that that are produced. What happens with it is determined by the LH pulse frequency, as I said before. In beef cows, in general, they don't ovulate. In dairy cows, up to 80% will ovulate, but the rest will actually either, in beef cows, turn over or go atresia. The LH secretion postpartum is very much controlled by the progesterone in the cycling cow, but if there is a negative energy balance, that definitely will suppress the LH secretion as well. Any type of other health status, suckling or maternal bond, just leads to not frequent enough LH pulses, which leads to follicular turnover, as you can see here. Good body condition, you see at the top graph that the follicle will ovulate. Poor body condition, it takes up to 14 waves before you get an ovulatory follicle. That very much has to do with waves relative to the ovulatory wave. If you look at the number and the mean of the LH pulses, the more and the higher they are, the more likely it is that the follicle will ovulate. So follicular diameter and estradiol will affect this. The bigger the follicle, the more estradiol it produces. The more estradiol it produces, the chances that it will ovulate will actually increase. What happens in the different types of dairy cows that we have? We have the traditional moderate yielding Frisian, British Frisian versus the modern high yielding Canadian or American, North American Holstein. And if you then look at how do they cycle and do they cycle normally, there is a huge difference in the normal cyclical patterns between those two different types of cows. Basically, as you can see, 78% of the traditional type of cows will have normal cyclical patterns postpartum. The more North American high-yielding Holstein will have less than 50% of these, and therefore then also have prolonged interval to first ovulation and an increased prolonged luteal phase. What we do know is that a lot of this is due to either failure of ovulation and not so much due to the formation of follicular cysts. We do know that pyometra, any type of cyst or non-detectable abnormalities are a reason of the other non-cyclical prolonged intervals that we find. One thing that could affect the prolonged luteal phase is uterine contamination, and I have a complete lecture on uterine disease in this same series, so I only will go through a few slides on this in this particular lecture. Uterine contamination is standard and is normal, but the inability for a cow to clear uterine contamination can negatively affect her ability to start cycling, because if there's uterine contamination, that leads to the signal to the cow that she is pregnant and therefore she will not cycle. It also has an effect on follicular growth, and follicle growth means larger follicles, as I said before, mean more estradiol. More estradiol means more heat expression. So ovarian follicles, we know, grow slower in animals with high numbers of pathogens in utero. As you know, there's many other conditions that can affect the cyclicity and the resumption of cyclicity in cows. Specifically, these are all conditions that are occurring at the day of calving or around calving, and you can see the knock-on effect that of this on the resumption of cyclicity and the ability of the cow to conceive again. So it's one of those things. The cow needs to be healthy and needs to be cycling, and any type of underlying condition can negatively affect that. What will happen with the first ovulation postpartum? In general, it's a silent ovulation due to the fact that there is no progesterone priming, and then after this you have a high percentage of short cycles. Progesterone priming, both in beef and dairy, is the key. The silent ovulation has to do with the fact that there's no signs of estrus in the animal, so we don't pick it up. Short and normal, this has some older data, but in general, the first cycle after the initial ovulation is shorter, again, due to progesterone priming. So basically this is beef and dairy plotted against each other. You see in dairy cows at the top, you have a number of follicular waves that turn over, and then there is ovulation. And in beef cows and 20% of the dairy cows, there's more turnover and then ovulation due to all the negative effects. So what do we, if we plot beef and dairy against each other? The previous one was the different type of dairy cows, but how if you plot beef and dairy against each other, what does that look like? Very much similar risk factors as I mentioned all along. On average, dairy cows do ovulate, have a relatively short period of days to ovulation, and also their days to first estrus are relatively short, or within 1 or 2 cycles, so within a month. They're always silent, nearly always silent, but as you see in beef cows, everything is much longer. The LH pulse frequency is important and is key to this whole process. And the whole thing, as I said before, your LH pulse frequency not being accurate enough to get an LH surge leads to anestrus. And to overcome this, you will need to either identify and then correct the underlying management factors, or you can reach for hormones, and that is one of the other lectures in this series as well on synchronization. So real or apparent anestrus, what is real and what is apparent? Real is if a follicle doesn't ovulate. It can either just maintain or become cystic, and anestrus, of course, is also caused by a persistent CL in absence of an embryo. Apparent anestrus is failure of detection, low intensity estrus, or in a lot of cases, actual a pregnancy that has already been established. So anovulatory anestrus, what can you do? Can you fix it? Yes, you can, because if the follicle is in the right stage, you can actually inject GnRH, and that will lead to a surge and therefore ovulation. However, you need to have a LH-dependent follicle, so it needs to be in the second phase of the growth. You can, of course, also give progesterone for this condition. That basically reboots the whole system, like kind of jump leads on a car with a dead battery. It will reboot the whole system in order for the cow then to come out of anestrus and start cycling. As I mentioned, LH dependency of the follicular phase is important for our GnRH. When you inject it, an animal that is in the FSH dependent phase will not respond to the GnRH injection, whereas an LH dependent will ovulate. Progesterone in anestrus cows helps because it will decrease the incidence of short cycles, help with the LH pulse frequency, and you can use it both in anestrus and cyclic animals, and it basically helps with the whole rebooting of the system. In general, we are talking about a 7, 8, or 9 day progesterone intravaginal device application with or without GnRH up front, with or without PGF. Remember, this is not a synchronization per se, this is rebooting of the system. There is some negative press or some negative effect of the use of ECG in these cases, because that can nearly lead to overstimulation and risk of multiple ovulation. A persistent CL, another reason for postpartum anestrus, could be having to do with uterine infections. More about that in a different lecture. And of course, if there's a CL, we can, of course, target that with prostaglandin. Apparent anestrus is one of those things that it's very easy to say, you just didn't pick it up. Animals, and specifically the high-yielding dairy cows, have a relatively short duration of estrus. So you can miss them quite easily, and then they may not be show strong estrus behavior. If you do it right, and if you want to do it right, you need to do it 4 to 5 times a day, and ideally with the use of some extra aids. And these 4 to 5 times cannot or shouldn't be associated with other events. So milking, feeding and everything, it should be sheerly dedicated to estrus detection. And that is a really hard sell, because to a farmer, that is, in between inverted commas, wasted time, because he could be doing other things than just looking at his cow. However, it is actually worth it to dedicate the time. Milk yield has a negative effect on estrus expression. Average versus high yield, you see that the duration of mountain, the incidence of standing and the duration of standing decreases as the yield goes up. In this case, it was from 33 kilograms a day to 46 kilograms a day. Lameness also will affect the estrus expression a cow will do. As you can see here, sound versus lame cow, and these are the higher yielders out of the previous slide. The sound cow will be much easier to detect when she is in heat, because her duration of mountain, her incidence of oversliffing and the incidence of standing estrus is just much higher than that of the lame cow. So you see, there's a lot of factors that need to happen and can happen just postpartum with the resumption, but also with the detection of estrus.